So I'm going to show a few things that I've noticed students struggling with when it comes to um, so I'm going to show a few things that I know students have been struggling with given the results of the hand stitch or the machine stitch sampler. There are some people have not used the reverse stitch at all, and I want to make sure that you know how to do that and where that stitch button is located. I'm going to move the camera up just a bit so you can see the reverse stitch button as well as where I'm going to be sewing. So I'm going to just place the fabric underneath at a 1/2 inch seam allowance here and sew a little bit and show you how to reverse stitch. So I'm going to start sewing. Let's say I'm beginning a seam. I'm going to start sewing. Let me put this up a little faster. So I'm going to start sewing, and as soon as I'm a couple stitches in, I'm going to press and hold the reverse stitch, and then when I let go, it goes back forward. I'm going to show that again. Sewing, reverse, it goes backwards. I let go, and it goes forward again. Sewing, press and hold, reverse stitch, and then start sewing again forward. So at the end of your seam, you would reverse stitch, and then you're done. And then, of course, this button allows you to release the needle from the fabric. You can lift up your foot, and then you can take that out. So I'm going to show you what that looks like then. You can see the places where I've reversed stitch. That means the stitches go on top of each other, and that allows the stitch to lock in place so that it won't unravel or come out. So that's what it would look like, and that's how you do that. So while you're stitching forward, you simply press and hold for a few stitches and then let go, and it will go back forward. So that's the first issue. The second one that I noticed was a lot of students did not know how to attach the pocket by pivoting on the needle. Either you weren't watching the video, or you didn't understand the video and didn't ask. But the pocket, all three sides, when you are connecting it to the fabric, can be attached without lifting, without taking the needle out of the fabric. So what I'm going to do here is I've made a tiny little pocket. It's a mitered pocket, but it doesn't even have a top hem. It's not really meant to be functional. It's just for this demonstration. So I just laid it on here. I haven't even pinned it in place. But I've got this in place. I'm going to show you how to pivot on the needle. First of all, I need to make sure that I'm going to be sewing very close to the fabric edge. It's not necessarily something I can measure because the pocket wouldn't necessarily go right on a seam. So I'm going to be making sure that my needle is going to be right along the edge of the fabric. And I can do that by double checking where the needle goes down. I'm going to move it over just a little bit. So I'm turning the hand wheel, and I can see that the needle's piercing the fabric right where I want it to be. So I'm going to sew. Of course, I'm going to lock my stitch in the beginning. So I'm going to go backwards. Okay, and then forward. And when I get to the corner, I'm going to go slow because I want the needle to stop right inside the fabric. If you notice, the needle is down. All I'm going to do is raise my foot up, rotate the fabric, the needle's still in, and I'm going to set the foot back down so that I can continue with attaching the pocket. I'm going to do that one more time. So I've reached the corner. I'm going to go nice and slow, raise the foot, rotate the fabric, and now continue on my way. And when I get to the top here, I'm going to reverse stitch, raise the needle, raise the foot, and I'm going to take this out and I'm going to cut these threads and then show you what I'm talking about here. All right. So here I have reverse stitched. This goes cleanly down, makes the turn, and cleanly back up to reverse stitch over here. So that's what the reverse stitch and pivoting on the needle looks like, where you leave the needle in the fabric, raise the foot, and rotate. The last thing I want to talk about is seam allowances. Even though I gave lots of instruction on that, students are still struggling with seam allowance. Now, the seam allowance has to do with the distance of the needle to the edge of the fabric. And what I've been telling students is right where the metal and plastic come together, that is your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Where the edge of the foot is your 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then the rest of them are marked on the throat plate. You can see the measurements right here. So 5/8 is just inside the first line of the grid. So I've got a piece of fabric here, and I'm going to make a seam allowance. Now, I'm not sewing anything together. This is just for demonstration purposes. But I'm going to line my fabric up with the edge of the foot inside here where the plastic and the metal come together, and that is for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So while I'm sewing, I'm not watching the needle. What I am constantly watching is to make sure that this fabric is staying in line with that place. So I'm going to sew, and I'm paying attention to this. My fabric is staying in the same location. Now if I start off, some students started off measured correctly, and then all of a sudden did this, and then got wider and wider and wider till you end up with, this is not there anymore. So you want to make sure, I'm going to go ahead and raise my needle up. You want to make sure that you are paying attention to where you are sewing at all times. Where is your seam allowance? Where is the edge of the fabric, and what is it lined up with? Right now it's lined up with where the plastic and the metal come together on the sewing machine foot. So I want to make sure that I'm paying attention to that. That's where I'm watching. Okay, so that was the first seam allowance, was to complete that, making sure that that edge stays lined up with the edge of the foot. Now when you get to the end of the seam, reverse to lock, okay? And then cut those threads. And it's important that the threads on the other end, that you cut those too. You always want to make sure. You can use the side cutter or a pair of scissors or snips. Okay, and this is where it went weird. Okay, remember where I started to let it go off track. So I'm going to pretend that's not there. I'm going to start my measuring from here. Now, for the 1/2 inch seam allowance, now I'm going to line up the edge of the fabric with the edge of the foot. I want to make sure that that stays lined up the whole way down. So now I'm going to start my seam, reverse stitch, and I'm keeping that lined up with, the fabric is staying lined up with the edge of the foot. I don't care what the needle's doing. The needle's going to keep going up and down. I need to pay attention to where the edge of the fabric is. And if you allow that to stray, because you have to control where it's going. You can't just say it did it, because you have control over what that sewing machine is doing and where you're paying attention. All right, so there's my second seam. And again, I want to show you. So I've got locked stitch. This row of stitching is a 1/4 inch away from the edge. This line is a 1/2 inch away from the edge. My last seam allowance is 5/8. So I'm going to again line up my fabric. This time 5/8 is on the throat plate here, so it's just inside that first line of the grid. So I'm going to set my needle down. Now I'm watching that I keep the edge of the fabric just inside the front of that grid. So I'm going to start my seam. I'm going to reverse stitch. And I'm watching the edge of my fabric and making sure that it's staying just inside the first edge of that block. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what they should look like in the distance apart. And if you don't remember your fractions, or if fractions confuse you, I want to show you a little something. Now 5/8, if you think about 5/8, what is 4/8? That's a 1/2 an inch. So 5/8 is 1/8 of an inch larger. So when you're looking at your stitching, they should not be equally spaced. So you've got 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, and then you're just a little bit further than that. These two will be closer together if you measured correctly. So you've got 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 5/8, and that should be the length all the way down the length of the fabric. So that should be about what the spacing looks like.